Good afternoon. My name is Weronika Gawińska-Brulikis. I represent the Janusz Kortyka Foundation. I'm honored to invite you to the second meeting of the project, The Seeds of History, organized by the Janusz Kortyka Foundation and the Polish Diaspora organization, Polish-American Strategic Initiative, EDU. Today's event is entitled Witnesses to the Truth on Katyn, Heroism Behind the Iron Curtain, presentation of the book Encounter with Katyn by Professor Wolsza. I would like to introduce our guest today, Mr. Jeśmin, President of PASI EDU. Good afternoon. Professor Tadeusz Wolsza. Good afternoon. Hello everyone. Dr. Damian Będnowski, the Deputy President of the Janusz Kortyka Foundation. Good afternoon. Hello, good afternoon. And the meeting will be moderated by Mr. Wojciech Jeśmin, the President of the PASI. Hello. The Seeds of History project is financed by the Chancellor of the Prime Minister as part of the Polish Diaspora and Poles Abroad 2021 competition. And blockpress.pl is a media partner, and would like to give the floor to Mr. Jeśmin. Mr. President, over to you.
Thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Janusz Kortyka Foundation's webinar with Professor Tadeusz Wolsza and his scholarly work titled Encounter with Katyn. I'm Dr. Jeśmin, President of PASI EDU, also known as the Polish-American Strategic Initiative Education Organization. Our primary mission is to educate Americans and interested others on Polish and Polish-American history by accurately presenting the facts and effectively countering the distortions. Our distinguished guest today is Professor Tadeusz Wolsza, who is a widely recognized Polish historian and political scientist. Born in Poland, he graduated from the University of Wrocław, and his academic affiliations include professor at the Institute of History at the Polish Academy of Sciences, excuse me, professor at the Kazimierz Wielki University at Bydgoszcz, and the Institute of National Remembrance. Professor Wolsza specializes in the contemporary history of Poland, particularly the wartime and post-war Polish political emigre community, the Katyn massacre, the anti-communist resistance movement in Poland, and Stalinist crimes in post-war Poland. He has published over 280 academic papers and books, with some of them translated into Russian, German, English, Italian, Serbian, and Slovakian. All of us at PASI and PASI EDU extend a warm welcome to Professor Wolsza. Our moderator today is Wojciech Jeśmin, who is co-founder and president of the Polish-American Strategic Initiative, Incorporated. Born and raised in Poland, Mr. Jeśmin was a pro-democracy activist and a member of the anti-communist opposition in Poland during 1976 to 1982. He was also a political prisoner in 1978 and again in 1981 to 1982. In 1982, Mr. Jeśmin became a political asylee in the United States. He's a naturalized U.S. citizen since 1990. He was president of the Polish National Congress of Southern California, as well as national director of the Polish-American Congress National Organization from 2015 to 2020. An active Polish-American lobbyist on Capitol Hill, he is also the recipient of the Officer's Cross of the Order Polonia Restytuta and the Cross of Freedom and Solidarity. At this time, I will turn the program over to Mr. Damian Będnowski, Vice President of the Board of the Janusz Kortyka Foundation.
Dziękuję serdecznie.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to welcome you on behalf of the entire team of the Janusz Kortyka Foundation in Warsaw. For me, it is a great honor, as this is yet another meeting within the framework of this project, Seeds of History, that we can implement. Ladies and gentlemen, this project, this meeting is a part and parcel of the great mission of our foundation, that is the Janusz Kurtyka Foundation, and the flagship project of this foundation is an award competition in the name of Janusz Kurtyka. That is to say, every year we award a prize to the best Polish historical work that falls in line with the main topic of the competition, and it's not only a symbolic award in the shape of a statuette that we present to the winner, but this is a very specific tool. This is an instrument that should help us to boost activities, scientific activities all over the world, and we also provide for the translation of the book awarded, and we are translating these books into some of the languages, and currently we are focusing on publishing those books in the English language, and also we translate into the German language in cooperation with very important and recognized scientific publishing houses in the West. The winner of the first edition of the Janusz Kurtyka Award competition was exactly Professor Tadeusz Wolsza. He is the main protagonist of our meeting tonight. And dear Professor, thank you very much for taking part in this meeting. We're going to talk about your book, Encounters with Katyn, and this is the book about the fate of witnesses of the Katyn massacre, the way the communist regime was prosecuting them as witnesses. So this is the book that outlines a broader perspective around the Katyn massacre. So the Program Council that took a decision to award you with the award in 2017 considers that this book fits very well our approach to the soft power of the Polish science. And undoubtedly, this book is a part of the so-called scientific diplomacy. This is how we use academic tools in order to influence the Western scientific world so that we can tell the Polish history, the true one, without stereotypes, and we present this history without any distortions, so as to present the Polish raison d'être, which is particularly important in today's context, and it is very much needed and justified under within the current context. And another element of this award is to promote the book. Professor Wolsza's book has been translated into the English language, and it was published in cooperation with the foundation, in cooperation with the Carolina Academic Press publishing house, and in order to expand the scope of its influence and to present it broader scientific community, we organized in 2018 a tour with the participation of Professor Wolsza. That it was a promotional tour. He had an opportunity to visit selected intellectual centers in the United States of America. That was the tour under the title of Freedom, and this is when Professor had an opportunity to meet the representatives of the Polish diaspora. He also met American scientists, and he was reading lectures that were related to the book's topic. Well, of course, this is the process that takes time, and undoubtedly the book, even such a canon of a book, still needs time to enter historiography. But undoubtedly, this particular book on the American market has been well received and noticed and recognized. And for instance, Holocaust and Genocide Studies recognized this book, and it is the position that is published by the University Press. And this is the effect that we would like to augment, and therefore quite a natural development for that project of the Janusz Kurtyka Award is the Today's Project, and I would like to thank you for taking part in this project under the title Seeds of History. We would like to build a network of contacts with the important organizations, Polish diaspora organizations in the United States of America and in Canada. And thus we would like to increase the presence of Polish historiography and Polish historical narrative in the Western scientific world. And this is how we develop contacts. This is how we reinforce networking activities. And we do realize that, in fact, that this cooperation is at its initial stage merely, and we know that we have very much ambitious plans, but undoubtedly this meeting is something that will help us to address two principal problems.
First, familiarity with the Polish history, mostly related to facts that awareness is poor. First, it's quite poor in the Western societies, which is an issue which is quite obvious and doesn't need any special explanations. There's another challenge that we have noticed, though. We have been cooperating with the Prime Minister's Chancellor. I would like to address that challenge too. Namely, let's talk about the Polish diaspora. People that have Polish roots, quite often, especially if they don't speak good Polish, they do not have access to good quality works, especially pertaining to the latest Polish history. And these are the two things that have actually encouraged us to take up this challenge. This is what has encouraged us to tell the history of Poland globally in cooperation with our friends from the Polish diaspora circles. For that reason, I would like to say thank you. Thank you to Polish American Strategic Initiatives EDU, Mr. Sokołowski. Sir, thank you for being so kind and working with us. Thank you for your participation in this meeting today. Thank you to another representative of the same organization, namely Mr. Wojciech Jeśmin. Sir, it's very kind of you to moderate this meeting with Professor Wolsza. And last but not least, the main protagonist of today's meeting, Professor Wolsza. Sir, you have created a really major work, and what we are seeing in your work is something which is by no means a cliché. It is not a book that is focusing on the crime itself, on how it happened, or even on its international dimension, but we are able to find out more about the witnesses of this crime that also turned out to be victims of said crime. Thank you very much to the Foundation. Thank you, Professor, for this important work. I hope that your work will be better visible, largely thanks to this project. And now we will have a short video that is dedicated to the book that we're going to discuss today. Enjoy.
Forests can hold many secrets, both terrible and dark, hidden in the whispering trees, echoing in the ground. Secrets, lies, screams, gunshots, and truth. This is the tale of a half-century of deceit, but also courage. The untold story of the Katyn massacre, a brutal murder of thousands of Polish prisoners of war. In the spring of 1940, around 22,000 Polish military and civilian elites were executed in the shadows of the Katyn forest. A terrible history narrated by the witnesses who were kept silent for decades. Encounter with Katyn by Professor Tadeusz Wolsza.
Dziękuję serdecznie.
Thank you very much. Let me give the floor to the moderator of today's meeting, Wojciech Jeśmin. Sir, over to you.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you very much, Jean. Thank you very much, Mr. Bębnowski, for the introductions. I would like to thank you for your preparation of this event, and without you, obviously, this would not have happened. Professor Wolsza, thank you very much for your cooperation and participation, and thank you also for years of scholarship and the depth of it. I would like to start with a few very general remarks, because Katyn is not just a historical issue. This is a very much a contemporary issue that affects also lots of things here in the United States, even now. Main issue is that language controls memory, and Katyn is portrayed here in so many different ways, but not really in a proper way. So it is called crime, murders, political assassinations, war crimes, but very unusual is the proper use of language here, which suggests that we should really stay with a proper designation for it, which is genocide. And what happened in Katyn is an expression of genocide in its purest form, and basically meets all the characteristics of the genocide. For political reasons, both historically as well right now contemporary, this is avoided. We have all kinds of attempts to avoid, falsify, and to reclassify this event, and it is in our best interest actually to stick with the proper designations here. And this is not just a matter of media, it is also a part of the political struggles that we have here in the United States on the legislative level. Very often American politicians try to avoid this subject and also to try to keep it as a case of just regular war crime. We cannot really allow it. This is not in our best national interest. We should keep the subject still alive, and really make sure that we don't allow history of our nation to be falsified. So this is a matter of actually a concerted effort on the part of many different players. It's not just that Russians or Americans are not very keen on proper classification here. We have also Germans and Jewish interests that don't really like Poland to be in the light, and don't like this historical issues to have proper designations. This happens for different reasons, but you know, effect is the same. Germans try to dilute the responsibility for the Second World War. So any kind of present mentioning of Polish suffering either caused by German or Russian side. And we have to remember that initially for the first 2 years until Russia was invaded by Germany, there was a very good cooperation as far as genocidal aspects of occupation of Polish territories by Russians and Germany. The same with Jewish interest. There is an effort to game this in a sense of obtaining advantages as far as political and economic sphere. Americans always used Poland as a bargaining chip in contacts with Russia, so this issue also is not really properly exposed here most of the time. And we had a few cases historically, 1952, Ray Madden Commission that undertook investigation of the subject on the congressional level, but not much really came out of it. And on this subject is still not properly handled here. There needs to be some final resolution to it, and this is not that we are trying to push this subject as some kind of anti-Russian politics here. It's rather a matter of truth and final closing of this issue. No, Russians don't want to accept that this was a genocidal action. They always stick to the theory that this was just a part of communist crimes. No, it's not the case because of the fact that this was willful and conscious and that attempt to eliminate approximately 1/3 of Polish officer corps. If we look at the numbers, pre-war numbers. So this is one of the definitions that obviously needs to be kept in our memory because we tend to forget about things. There's lots of neglect as far as historical narration in the United States, and unfortunately there is this issue of almost dereliction of duty here on our part. We have generational responsibility to keep certain issues alive and defend the good name of Poland, and we have to defend Polish national interests. Unfortunately, there is lots of Polonophobic attitudes in the United States, and we can see it in media, we can see it in academia, and also on the legislative level in the US Congress. Very often those things come up. So we have to be better organized. We have to also make sure that events like this are continued. I hope that this is just the first step on a much closer cooperation between academic circles in Poland and also our organizations in the United States here. There is a need for not only lectures, but also conferences, and we would be very happy to be a part of it. Educational side of it is important, but also we have to remember that ultimately this is about politics, and we have to be also cognizant of the fact that we should be present on a legislative level here, and we have to also lobby American administration very often on many different issues. I would like to also say that we have a very general problem that actually erases Poland from this equation here completely, almost, in the United States. There is a problem with American education in general that basically treats the Second World War almost in the context of extermination of Jewish population of Europe. And there is this issue of so-called Holocaustization of American education. So we have to counteract Poland's suffering cannot be erased from history. And this is very important that we do our best to make sure that this does not happen. So I will finish maybe here. I would like to give floor to Professor Tadeusz Wolsza. Professor, the floor is yours.
Dziękuję bardzo.
Thank you very much. And first and foremost, I would like to invite you to thank you for your kind invitation to take part of this meeting. I would like to say that for me as an author, it is a very pleasant event. For any author, it is a pleasant event to be able to meet the readers and to present the book, particularly given the fact that among the participants of this meeting, we have not only Polish readers of the book, we have quite a wide group of people who are interested in the history of Poland, and the Katyn massacre is a part of our history, a very tragic event in the Polish history. And one of the gentlemen said that almost 1/3 of the officers' corps was murdered then. But please remember that primarily those were soldiers in the reserve. Most of them were the officers in reserve prior to the outbreak of World War II. And at that time, and after being trained in the army, they were already working as intelligentsia. They were medical doctors, lawyers, professors, journalists. Those were social and political activists. Those were the true elite. So if you think of that event, how to call that Katyn event, to say that that was genocide is a very proper description of that event. The objective was crystal clear: to eliminate, to liquidate the Polish elite, the most dangerous part of Polish society for the Soviets, because the society devoid of the elite is an easy prey to manipulate. And now just a few words of what I'm going to talk about. Let me give you an outline. First and foremost, I would like to talk about I'll give some brief information about the massacre itself, because it is important from the point of view of my subsequent parts of my presentation today. And on the basis of the decision of March 1940, the supreme authorities of the Soviet Union, and let me just mention Stalin, on the basis of the expertise presented by Lavrentiy Beria, and he was the commissioner for security matters, the authorities took a decision to murder all Polish citizens in Ostaszków-Starobielsky and Kozielsk, but not only in those three camps. In fact, that was the decision that referred to more than a dozen of prisons spread around the territories of Western Ukraine and Belarus. Therefore, the number of the murdered exceeded significantly the number of 14,500 persons, because that was the initial count of those who were apprehended and then sent to the prisoners' camp. And to that, we should add the new prisoners and arrested. And within that, we had people of different professions and different political views. And there were people who, from the point of view of Polish authorities, could in the future pose a threat to the reinforcement of the Soviet authority in the occupied territories. Therefore, that number increased to 22,000 people plus. But that is not a closed list, and I would like to underscore that, because we still do not know the numbers on the so-called Belarusian list. And it may well happen that the 22,000 people, that this number shall be further increased by a certain number of victims we do not know yet. They were buried in many different places so as to conceal the scale of the Katyn massacre. So the case of the Katyn massacre was a very important case for the Polish government in exile in London. For one reason, the Poles, the Polish government, after the Sikorski-Majskie treaty was signed, they could establish the Polish army in the east, and General Anders commanded the army, and a lot of his life he spent in Lubyanka, beginning with 1939 until 1941. So he was prisoner number one as far as the rank of the Polish officers is concerned, who were imprisoned in the Soviet Union. But once he was freed and once he was nominated as the commander of the Polish army in the East, he immediately started looking for those officers. But his quest was unsuccessful. The Soviets knew about the crime, obviously, and therefore they were, in fact, not capable of giving any credible answers as to the fate of the Polish officers. They were giving some absurd type of information, and for instance, they were saying that the Polish officers either ran away to Manchuria, or perhaps the Polish officers were somewhere in the Far East, and it was merely a matter of time for them to return and thus join the ranks of the Second Corps, because that was the name of the military formation that was being established by General Anders. So General Anders was cognizant of the fact that matters were taking a bad turn, and it was exceedingly difficult to understand the fate of the Polish officers. And Józef Czapski became his plenipotentiary for the search of the Polish officers. And Józef Czapski used to be a prisoner in Starobielsk. He was in one of those camps from which Polish officers were executed. Józef Czapski started his quest, but he failed, although there was a certain point of time during Józef Czapski's mission that he understood that it was very important to see what the fate of the Polish officers, because once he came across a map, and on that map he saw that some sites in the territory of the Soviet Union were marked with stars. At that time he didn't know what he saw, but sometime later, once the Katyn massacre became an international case after 1943, he came to a conclusion that he had already seen a map with the stars indicating the places of imprisonment of the Polish officers. So those sites with the red stars, those were the sites of the camps for Poles. But at that time, he had not known it somewhere in the beginning of 1942 when he first saw the map. So it was only later on that he could verify that knowledge, but the Poles were no longer in the Soviet Union at the time, because General Anders' army left the Soviet Union in spring 1942. So he thought of that map, but a bit later on. And only the Germans in 1943, in April, released information on the discovery of the burial sites of the Polish officers in Katyn. And this is when the Katyn massacre case was on the table again. The Germans were 100% sure that it was not their crime. Therefore, they immediately made it a very loud case. No, they were not in support of Poland. It was not that the Germans all of a sudden became fond of the Poles, but Germans knew one thing, that it was important for them, not the Poles. It was important from the German point of view. They knew that the crime against the Polish officers done by the Soviets could have affected the course of the war, maybe indirectly, but still, at least that was the case. that could drive a wedge between the allies. So Goebbels thought that would actually make the allies quarrel. And this is what he had in mind when he presented the case to Hitler. He said at the time that this is the card they could play for months to go. That Katyn would give us fuel, he said, to weaken the alliance. Perhaps the Americans and the British would stop cooperation with the Soviets, and that may alter the course of the war. So the Germans hoped for that. The truth was different, and the English and the Americans did not sacrifice the Soviets, they sacrificed the Polish government in exile, because for them the union with the Soviet Union was more important. The alliance with the Soviet Union was more important than the alliance with the Polish government in exile. And the Soviet Union was ready to march thousands of soldiers to the front line, and the Polish resources had been exhausted by that time. So there was Anglo-Saxon logic about it. And the Anglo-Saxons were looking at those events not from the point of view of the Polish-English alliance. It was rather a case of benefits. So the more Soviet troops are on the front line, the fewer American and British soldiers would die in Western Europe and in the Far East. So the Poles who had been guests on the British Isles for many years, all of a sudden became intruders. Hence the German idea to utilize the Katyn massacre. But it was no to benefit to them as the Germans, but still it was something that helped the Polish initiatives to investigate the case. And that is why in the release of information about the massacre in 1943 by the Germans is so very much important from the point of view of investigating all those questions related to the events that took place in spring in 1940. So in 1943, Germans were very serious about it. They were very attentive to it. They wanted the international organization, they wanted the International Red Cross to investigate the case, and the Polish government in exile had a similar idea, and the Polish government addressed the International Red Cross with a request to deal with this case. But to deal with that case, the International Red Cross had to receive an approval from all the stakeholders. Who were the stakeholders? Germany, because those were the ones who found out about the case. It was the Polish authority, because it was the case about the Polish citizens. But there is the third country, a very important country at stake, which was the Soviet Union, because the crime was committed in the territory of the Soviet Union. So the International Red Cross received a green light from the Germans and the Poles, but not from the Soviet Union. And therefore, that case at that time, in 1943, that case collapsed. But what was the result of it? The Soviets received an opportunity to utilize that event in the future. And in the future, they would say that the Polish government was cooperating with the Nazi Germany because they together applied to the International Red Cross to investigate the case. So for the Soviets, it was a very important argument in their propaganda type of activity. And when the case was finally not filed with the International Red Cross Committee, the Germans decided that they will take a different course, but still they would pursue an international pathway. So the Germans established an international medical committee. The International Medical Committee comprised a dozen or so of medical doctors from the occupied territories. That was the weak point of that committee. The only neutral medical doctor was Francois Leville from Switzerland, and he was a guarantor of the neutrality of investigation. He was there to guarantee the credibility of the investigation, because in invitation were addressed to the Spanish and Swedish and Portuguese and Turkish medical doctors, but those invitations had not been accepted. Even if had they even been accepted, still there was a problem with Antonio Pique from Spain, and it all failed. And Antonio Pique, at the very last moment of time, decided not to travel, and therefore he never reached Katyn. So that international physicians committee initiated investigative activities, and they confirmed the responsibility of the Soviet government.
Ferenc Orsa, Hungarian doctor, was an important member of this committee. He looked at the residue from the graves, and he was able to date, and the date was spring 1940, and basically the committee opined, I used a word similar to judgment, so they judged it to be the case that it was the Soviets who were responsible and the crime was committed in the spring 1914. And the Polish Technical Committee of the Polish Red Cross also received that information. By the way, they had been sent there to identify the body. So there are two parallel committees, the International Red Cross Committee, the Polish Red Cross Committee, and before that there had been a German committee as well, the Central Army Committee, headed by General Gerald Butz, who was a professor. And basically these are the first witnesses. They are there, they are in Katyn, and they can look at the remains of the people that are being disinterred. People do research, doctors actually research the evidence they have. The medicine actually was of high quality. Once they said, if Ferenc Orsa had announced that research and there had been no World War II, in all probability, he might have been given Nobel Prize in medicine. At the time, it seemed improbable. Some people tended to disbelieve his words, but then it turned out to be true. And later, doctors, various doctors who worked on the case, used Ferenc's research, which was of very high quality indeed, and it played an important role at the time. So the Germans decided to issue an invitation to invite people to Katyn, basically to invite witnesses from all over Europe, occupied Europe that is. To them, it was important to invite people from the general governorship, and they wanted to invite mostly Poles, the Polish witnesses, who would come over, watch, listen to commentaries, and then they would disseminate this information not only in occupied Poland, but also to spread it further, to disseminate further, including to the Polish government in exile. They wanted Katyn to be as powerful as possible, so they wanted to invite scientists and doctors and writers and journalists as well, basically people who were in touch with the media. Notice, this is a calculated effort on the part of the Third Reich to prove that it was the Soviets who were responsible. Who would do it better? Journalists who know how to write, and then scientists who would confirm the results of the work of the previous committee, and writers who would write books on the very subject. These people have power because they are in touch with media. Radio played a very important role as well at that time. The year is 1943. Radio there? How come, you could ask? What the Germans did, they came up with this radio studio. There were microphones placed next to the graves. and they were actually recording everything that was happening there, including the commentaries. Then all that evidence was being sent to Berlin. German radio stations would use those recordings in the German Nazi propaganda. Quite revolutionary, you could say. 1943, almost live. It was as early as that somebody came up with this ingenious idea. They also had special equipment to record records, and they recorded interviews, opinions provided by witnesses, photos were taken of all the people present there, and anyone who arrived there would receive a number of various artifacts that were uncovered. It could be a button from a military uniform or something else, a token to remember this visit. Some people would get into a grave and collect the ropes used to tie the hands of the Polish officers. We know of at least 2 such cases. So Germans would actually do that. There are such ropes still available. I believe one of them is still in London, in one of the museums there. So a large-scale campaign. A lot of resources and many people were involved. So many people, many resources. So a question arises. How many witnesses were involved? That's an interesting question. I'm not sure if you know. 31,000 people were brought over by the Germans. And mind you, it's not a mistake, 31,000 people. It's the war is raging. It's the East, and they were able to transport as many as 31,000 people to witness what happened there. Mind you, these are 30,000 Wehrmacht soldiers and 1,000 were the remaining guests. Why so many German soldiers? It was about making the German soldiers believe that it's worthwhile to fight the Soviets. If you fight poorly, if you yield, said the officers to the soldiers, this is the fate that awaits you. This is what's going to happen to you, said the officers to regular soldiers. Now, the Polish national interest is somewhat different. We don't care so much about what's going to happen to the Germans. We would like Germany to lose the war, and the members of the Polish delegations have something else on their minds. So Poles go there, they go to Katyn, so that finally they can resolve the following important issue: why and when the Polish officers died. And then they learn that they died in 1940, and the Soviets are the perpetrators. So this is the first group of the Polish delegates who visited Katyn. I did quite a lot of deep research there. In 1943, around 60 people left, people who had visited the place where the crime was committed. Józef Mackiewicz, Fardynian, Gettel, Jan Emil Skipski, and other journalists and writers and doctors too. Marian Wodziński, the head of the Polish Red Cross Committee, a forensic doctor, Kazimierz Skarżyński, the deputy president of the Polish Red Cross Committee. These are important people who will later give testimony on that crime. And there is another important group of witnesses, around 400 of them. So, in 1940, where the Polish officers were being executed, Soviets decided not to murder around 400 people in the first 3 sites because they decided they could come in handy later due to their scientific achievements, their professions. They could be useful for the Red Army later on, or for the Soviet politics and the economy. Stanisław Swianiewicz, a professor of the Stefan Batory University in Vilnius, was one of them. He was an expert in the German and Soviet economy. There are many other of them, 400 of them altogether. And they knew a lot, as it later turned out, about the Katyn massacre. I'm not going to discuss them separately, but a few words about Stanisław Swianiewicz, what role he could actually play. By the way, he was very close to dying. He was taken away from Kozielsko to Gniezdów, and there he got separated from the group that he was with. His colleagues were taken by a mysterious truck with tainted windows, and this car was absent for 30 minutes, then it was back. Swianiewicz didn't know what happened to his friends. There he was, in the train. He was trying to eavesdrop and look through the cracks to see what was going on, but he was lost. He didn't know. Only years later did he learn what this half an hour was all about. It was as much time as was needed to drive from one place to another, from the train to the site of the execution. Now, we are talking about a puzzle, and Swianiewicz was an important witness who helped to put the piece of the puzzles together because he knew a lot about how it all happened, how the events unfolded. And he reported all that before the Katyn committee. It worked in World War II. It was then that he sent his testimony to a number of organizations, including the Polish government in exile. He also testified before the Madden committee, and he actually reiterated all of that in the early 50s. So I divided witnesses into 2 groups, first-hand witnesses and second-hand witnesses, so to speak. So direct witnesses are those who were there in 1940. And there are also those who were there, but 3 years later. The first group are the survivors. They personally experienced these events. They were friends with people who died there. For some time, they might have been unaware of what had happened there. Later, the Katyn massacre became international. It was after 1943 and after the end of the Second World War. And then they realized that the crime was committed, and it was committed by the Soviets in 1940. The other group are those who were there in 1943, invited by the Germans, and the one who worked for International Medical Committee. They were not the ones who were POWs or people who were imprisoned in those 3 murder sites. We're talking about Kozielsko, Staszków, and Starobieck. And then The Soviet committee asked Burbienko to create his own commission, which put into doubt the German works, claiming that actually it was the Germans who committed the crimes in 1941, and the POWs were taken over by the Germans, who murdered all the Poles. That was the Soviet version, and it introduced some mess. The English-speaking nations stood by the Soviet Union, and what surfaced was the Soviet interpretation. It was an attempt to influence the Polish government in exile.
And so they even apologized to Moscow. He apologized to Stalin, and then he claimed that Germany was responsible for the Katyn massacre. The Polish authorities behaved the only way they could at that time. They simply did not take any position. And the situation of the Polish government at that time was very dramatic. One may say that the position of the Polish government in London was deteriorated a lot, and the English were vociferous in saying that the Poles were not helpful. They were interfering, and therefore the Polish government was tactically silent, and that tactical silence was helpful to Stalin and was useful to Stalin. So the Russians decided to go further with this case after the end of the war. So, being cognizant of the fact that Poland was already a communist country, that Poland was dominated by the NKVD and by the communists, they decided to stage a court on Katyn in Warsaw, and this is how they would blame Germany for the Katyn massacre. So they started looking for witnesses on a mass scale, on the grand scale, obviously looking for those who were in Katyn. And quite naturally, they were interested in the Poles that visited Katyn in 1943. So they were looking for Skarżyński, for Ciński, for Szabesta, for Edward Gorski, and for medical doctors and also staff of the Polish Red Cross who visited their site. Some of them were found and they were forced to change their opinion on the Katyn massacre, the Katyn crime. And some people knew what was happening. Ferdynand Gettel and Piski and Władysław Kabecki, Józef Mackiewicz, or for instance, some other people, they knew what was happening and they fled, because they knew that if they were caught by the Soviets, then they would either be imprisoned and they would have to serve a prison sentence, or they will actually be murdered. So the process was there. There was a team of public prosecutor Robert Martini, who was a very good lawyer, who was a medical doctor at the University of Jan Kazimierz in Lwów before the war, was a very good lawyer. And a highly competent lawyer was leading the team of prosecutors, and he had a team of very good lawyers. Those were the graduates of the Jagiellonian University. So they collected the documents, they did the interviews, they were really good and diligent in their work. But once all the files were collected, they came to the conclusion that it would be not possible to prove that the Germans committed the crime. And witnesses were saying different things, being under duress. So the Katyn process in Warsaw didn't work, and Roman Martini was murdered in a mysterious way, but it was not a political murder. I think it was more of a personal matter, because he was killed by a fiancé of a woman with whom he had intimate contacts. Therefore, Minister Świątkowski, the Minister of Justice in the communist Poland, was summoned to Moscow, and he was ordered to forget about the Katyn process in Warsaw. which is not to say that the Soviets dropped the idea of proving that they were innocent. Another attempt was undertaken by them during the meeting of the International Military Tribunal in Nuremberg, 1946. And that second attempt was to prove to the whole world that it was not a crime committed by the Soviets. Yuri Pokrovsky, the Soviet prosecutor, based his submissions on an important finding, rather, and that would give Soviet Russia a priority, because the prosecutors from the US, from Britain, and from the Soviet Union already at their first meeting, as they were forming the tribunal, they established that individual cases shall be run by those prosecutors who are most interested in that particular case. So as far as the Katyn case is concerned, of course, the Soviets were very much interested in that case, because the Katyn massacre took place in the territory of the Soviet Union. So it was Soviet priority, a matter of Soviet priority. So Pokrovsky had a very important argument, and therefore he came to a conclusion, an idea that he would run that case in his own way. So he would run this case in any way that would be beneficial to the Kremlin. Therefore, during the first meeting on the Katyn massacre, he defined that as an act of genocide. So it was not an idea of American or Polish or British prosecutors. It was Pokrovsky's idea. Pokrovsky was sure, confident that he would be capable of running the case during the Nuremberg trial in an easy way. So he already then used the notion of the German, or of the crime of genocide committed by the Germans. But the Americans and the British were rather skeptical. Only that their arguments were not as convincing, and they were not really confident in the Germans being innocent, and only the activities of German defending lawyers who were defending German citizens, including criminals who were responsible for war crimes during World War II, that actually helped the Americans and the British to take a decision, because the defending lawyers from Germany submitted a request to many different institutions to provide for legal aid. That is, of course, a modern legal speak, but at that time it was not the case named that way. But they asked the Polish general to submit some materials in order to help them to defend the German citizens, some of them criminals, and General Anders said that he would not cooperate with the Germans because they were criminals, but Katyn had to be explained. And that is why Poland, in a very, how should I put it, illegally, passed on some of that documentation. So using Mr. Szymański, an American officer of the Polish origin, to pass on some of the documentation to Americans. So Germans had some additional documentation available, a very important piece of documentation that was made available to the Germans, and it was made available by the Poles. So the final was such that in Nuremberg, they did not decide who murdered the Polish officers in Katyn. Germany was not convicted for that crime. The case was silenced, but the entire world started thinking, if not the Germans, then who? The Poles could not possibly kill themselves. And there was no such official record in the final document of the Nuremberg trials, but still this can be understood as a great success on the way to explain the Katyn massacre. And that was also the merit of German lawyers, but also Polish witnesses who did not speak in Nuremberg, but before that they had already submitted their witness statements, and their witness statements were heard in Nuremberg or sent to Nuremberg trial. But it was important to see that the Germans at that time claimed that Friedrich Arends, a German officer, was responsible for that crime, as he allegedly was a commander of the German execution squad in Katyn. So that name was used by the Soviet prosecutors as they were leading the case, and the German solicitors found that particular officer in 1946. He was a communications officer. He was not a criminal. He was taken to Nuremberg, and on the basis of the then available documentation, it was proven that in September 1941, when the Poles were to be allegedly murdered by the Germans, that officer was very far away from Katyn, and his communications battalion regiment had nothing to do with Katyn at all. And that was another very important argument in the case. And then silence fell. The blanket of silence fell, and the Katyn case was no longer proceeded in the international arena. So the Soviets were defeated. Another important event, that was the Madden Committee. And this is how Americans, primarily Americans, started dealing with the Katyn massacre. So apart from Nuremberg trials, the Americans and the British were not really interested in the Katyn massacre. They were avoiding the case. They simply wanted to maintain good relations with the Soviets, and the Americans and the British thought it was not worth picking up the case because that could spoil the relations. However, once the Soviet Union changed its policy around the world, and that was already the context of the Korean War, the United States of America assumed a different position with regard to the Katyn massacre. In New York, there was information about American officers being murdered in Korea using the Katyn shot in the back of the head. And it was not Koreans' idea. So earlier on, Polish officers had been killed in exactly the same way. So American officers were killed with a shot in the back of a head. So all of a sudden, Katyn found its place to the public discourse in the United States of America. The case had to be investigated. So the Ray Madden Committee received the right to deal with the investigation of the Katyn massacre because it became an important case from the point of view of propaganda, but also in the US policy with regard to the Soviet Union. So the Ray Madden Committee is very important. More than 280 witnesses were heard by the Ray Madden Committee. They were working in the US, in Britain, in Western Germany. They heard witnesses from many different countries. First and foremost, they wanted to hear as many Polish witnesses as possible. So General Volkowicki, who was in Kozielsk, submitted his deposition to Mr. Ciche. Colonel Lubadziecki, Stanisław Sianiewicz also made their depositions. So those depositions were made by those who were credible, by those who had knowledge. Those were the people who were imprisoned by the Soviets, and those were the people who had something to do with that case. Americans found Keter, Mackiewicz, Chapsky, and they addressed General Anders. So the Ray Madden Committee heard the depositions of the International Medical Committee summoned by the Germans, François Leville, the Hungarian medical doctor. Many doctors, those medical doctors who were in Katyn 1943 investigating the case, they also were making their depositions to the Ray Madden Committee. Also, famous John Van Vliet, famous American officer, made his deposition to Ray Madden Committee. He was a German prisoner of war who in 1943 visited Katyn because the Germans also took some prisoners to Katyn, and John Van Vliet wrote a number of reports. In 1944, in 1945, those reports were hidden somewhere there in the archives of the White House, but after the war, he recreated those documents, and all of a sudden, it turned out that those documents were very important. Those were documents of really great significance. So the Raid Madam Committee determined clearly that the crime was committed by the Soviets in 1940, and that document, with that particular conclusion, was sent to the countries behind the Curtain Wall. So that document, those conclusions were forwarded to the Soviet Union and to Poland and to other countries. What was the Kremlin's reaction? Quite obviously, the Kremlin rejected the conclusions of the Raid Madam Committee, and in a very shrewd way, the Kremlin unleashed a counteroffensive. So the Soviets wrote back saying that beginning in 1944, when Nikolai Burdenko's committee was working, Americans had 8 years to reject Burdenko's conclusions, and for 8 years, Americans did nothing to start any discussions on Burdenko's conclusions. And what does it mean that 8 years later, Americans now would alter something that had already been decided upon? So it was very much a shrewd tactic. And so Americans' loyalty before that played against the Americans in 1950. So the Raid Madam Committee conclusions were not acknowledged in the countries that were behind the Iron Curtain. So in the United Nations, he could not succeed either.
You need to be anonymous to pass a resolution in the UN, and you can guess who protested. First and foremost, it was the Soviet Union and the Polish delegate. They said that nobody should actually study that. So Raid Madam's committee's work was very important. It was significant because it helped to clarify the circumstances surrounding the Katyn crime. In 1952, though, it had no impact on shedding light on this issue in the Western countries on the other side of the Iron Curtain, or rather on the other side of the Iron Curtain. So in the eastern part of Europe, the crime had allegedly been committed by the Germans. In Poland, though, there were some protests. There were certain individual actions and protests taken by people who demanded that it's clarified. However, the Polish communist courts would send those people to jail. So, in the Soviet-occupied Poland, or the Poland controlled by the Soviets after 1945, basically there were dozens of people who were sent to prison for presenting the truth. And the USSR had their own policy. They rejected the truth about the Katyn crime. And they came up with two other messages. The anti-Katyn is the first one, namely, yes, we did commit the crime, but there was another crime, that is, the crime committed by the Polish soldiers on the Soviet POWs after the Polish-Soviet War. This anti-Katyn concept was propagated by the Soviets and the Russians after 1989. So you've got Katyn on the one hand and the anti-Katyn crime. So Katyn is the lesser crime, or rather anti-Katyn is a lesser crime than Katyn. What did the Soviets, or rather Russians, claim? They claimed that 14,000 people died there because they stuck to that version. Now, they suggested that Poles murdered over 30,000 Red Army soldiers in the aftermath of the Polish-Soviet War. And Katyn is another thing. Basically, in English, you write it the same way. What is it about? So there is Katyn, another location, and there Germans murdered a whole village. So the delegations that came to the USSR in the 70s and 80s, they would be taken on a trip to Katyn. And there, the American delegations and Western European delegations, as well as people from Central and Eastern Europe, they said, this is Katyn, or rather Katyn, as it was pronounced in English, and this is where Germans murdered a huge number of people, including members of the families. And it is now a part of the dramatic history of the Soviet Union. Few people realized that it was manipulation. So there are two separate locations, and in English they are spelled the same way. In Polish or in other languages, they sound separately, they sound differently. However, since they sound the same way in English, it confused the situation, it muddled the waters, and this is what the Soviets were after. They didn't want the situation to be clear. They wanted things to be disputable, because when things are not clear, you can manipulate facts, and witnesses play no role at all. So, the Americans and the Western politicians that visited Katyn basically fell for that Soviet trick. In 1990, on the 13th of April, this is when the situation was solved, because a Soviet agency, press agency, that announced the truth about the massacre. The chapter is closed, but not really, because it was about, it takes some time before they took some time before they actually diverged from that version of events again. And now they have another narrative. They are those Russian pseudo-historians. They publish books and papers, and they promote another version of history. Basically, it was the 1941 that the Germans committed the crime. By the way, these are close to the highest echelon of the Russian power at this point. So they are not just third-tier historians, no. And for that reason, we need to keep discussing this subject. We need to keep talking about that. Here, we in Poland, we know the truth. We have all these history books, there are academic conferences, TV shows, TV documentaries, and we know for a fact who was responsible. What about Russia? What about the Russian Federation? Imagine that you organize a query there. Well, I'm afraid of the results, of the potential results that you will get there. I believe it would be 50-50. What do I mean by that? People would claim that it was not the Soviets, but the Germans who were responsible. And it could be even worse. Memorial. Just a small number of heroic Russians who worked in Russia, activists, they were quite heroic, but whatever truth they uncovered was hidden. The members of this group fall prey to persecution and repressions. They are being persecuted by the authorities. This is the end of my lecture, and I'm at your service, ladies and gentlemen.
Professor Wolsza, we have a few questions here. So the first question
Proszę bardzo.
concerns possible cooperation.
Nie słyszę.
I cannot hear you, said the professor.
I'm unmuted right now.
Jest.
Can you hear me now?
Tak, ja słyszę, jest. Okay.
Okay, perfect.
Yes, I can hear you.
So the first question deals with the possible and actually factual cooperation of Germans and Russians until 1941. So we know about meetings that were directed towards actually coordination of different actions against Polish intellectuals, Polish elites, both on territories occupied by Germany as well as Russia. So could you shed some light on it? Is it possible that Germans had foreknowledge of the Katyn crime?
Dobrze. Proszę Państwa, ja od razu będę odpowiadał na każde pytanie.
I will take these questions one by one. I believe this would be the best way to go. This is an important question. In the Katyn crime discourse, what you see often is the potential German-Soviet cooperation. Until June 1941, Soviets and Germans had been working closely. It was Poland that was their enemy. Now, where did they cooperate? First, it was about coming up with a joint policy towards Poland. Basically, Poland was meant to disappear from the map of the world. Secondly, they wanted to eliminate the intellectual elites of the Polish state. For that reason, AB and Katyn. AB is a German action, but basically it happened at roughly the same time. It was aimed at eliminating educated people in Poland. Now, thirdly, both Germans and Russians wanted to inform the other party about the Polish underground efforts, the Polish resistance, in other words. So basically, it was about cooperating together against all these efforts that were directed against both occupiers. Meetings took place. Gestapo officers and NKVD officers met. I believe they took place in 1939 and 1940 in Kraków and Zakopane, possibly also in Lviv. I'm not sure, but I believe so. High-tier meetings, I would say. A number of issues were discussed. At none of that meetings there was any evidence that the Germans were informed in detail about the Katyn massacre. So I have not found any evidence to that effect. You know, we did this and you probably did that. So there was an exchange of information, a common policy vis-a-vis the Polish society was considered. However, the Katyn massacre was not disclosed to Germans, at least at the time. The Germans might have asked the Soviets to release certain people that they care about. There were certain German citizens imprisoned by the Soviets, for example, those that had served in the German army. And those officers got released. But it was not because Germans were informed of the pending executions and that it was the last moment to do that. It was the German officers' families that came up with this initiative. What about Józef Czapski? There, it was due to the Italian court's intervention. The neutral countries also intervened.
So the neutral states were appealing to the German authorities to release some persons. So I think that if there were meetings, and there were meetings, I'm sure we have certainty that those meetings of NKWD and Gestapo, they were not talking about the executions in Katyn. That is my state of knowledge. Maybe I'm wrong, but I have not found any documents to state the other. More questions, please? Any more questions?
Yes, I would concur that most probably there was no foreknowledge of the fact because of the time of release of this information. This was not released immediately after Germans occupied terrain where Katyn was located. So but most probably, if they knew beforehand, this information would become public much earlier. Next question, is it possible that Russians tried to frame Germans using German ammunition during the conduct of the murders?
Tak. Tak, to jest ważna sprawa.
Yes, yes, and that is very important because, as I said before, in the period 1939-41, both the Germans and the Soviets were allies. And that is the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact that was used as the basis for unleashing the offensive against Poland. And prior to the outbreak of the war against the Soviet Union in 1941, both countries were supporting each other. For instance, in the period of the attack against France, the Soviet Union sent to Germany, was sending to Germany some strategic raw materials. The Germans were helping the Soviet Union. They were giving military help to the Soviet Union in weaponry and ammunition. So that was quite an intensive cooperation on the day of unleashing aggression of the German Reich against the Soviet Union. On the border, there were trains that were ready to cross the Soviet-German border, because until the very moment of time, both countries were concealing their aims and objectives, and Germany did not want to unmask their attack. So, in fact, the last trains from Germany to the Soviet Union were going on the night when the war began. And in the Soviet army, they were using German ammunition. Not only the Soviets were using German ammunition, in fact, Germans were sending their ammunition to the countries all over the world. And the Soviets were executing, were doing executions, carrying out executions with the use of German ammunition. And when medical commissions were investigating the Katyn massacre on site, they immediately had to face the problem, what to do with the munitions they found. And that was the German munitions, because Germans initially tried to conceal that, because that was an evidence that would corroborate the thesis that it was the Germans who committed the crime. So they were not talking about it in the German press, for instance, because that was an important argument against Germany. And that could have been a crown piece of evidence, because the Germans were saying, right, we found the victims of the Soviet crimes. So we had found tens of thousands of Polish officers murdered, and their remains had been identified. And indeed, on the crime scene, they found some munitions. And then it turns out that they were of German manufacturing. So immediately, that would go against the German line of argumentation. So initially, they were silencing that fact. And only later on, once Burdenko's committee started working and became more famous, the German arguments were used in such a way so as to explain the international community the origin of the German munition that was used there. And the case was established and was clarified, but for some time that was quite a problematic issue. It was quite a confounding factor for the Germans. And so later on it was explained, and it became a meaningful piece of evidence, but it was easy to explain. German factories were selling those munitions to many different countries, and within the framework of Soviet-Nazi military cooperation, the Russians were not using any other munitions because they were using the munitions they were receiving from the Third Reich. So that is the case that has already been described in the scientific literature. But then in 1943 and later in 1944, that particular factor could work against the German interpretation of the course of events. And indeed, at that time, it was a confounding factor. Next question, please.
Next question. We had 400 officers that were spared by the Russians, either because of their alleged pro-Russian sympathies, or because of the possible usefulness for different projects of the Soviet state. Can you tell how many of them became prominent as far as their use, let's say, in political fights in Poland with the Polish underground state or after the war?
To rzeczywiście jest sprawa.
Well, indeed, those are those who survived, the survivors, miraculous survivivors. Quite an interesting issue, because for some time there was even that piece of information that those are the people who were the people who started cooperating with the Soviet authorities. Partially that was true, because some of the survivors in Stashkov, Starobielsk and Kozielsk declared their will to start cooperation with the Soviets. There were a few dozens of those, but the others were, from the point of view of the Soviet Union, the others were of scientific value, or they had some important military skills. As far as the scientific value is concerned, that is to say that those, for instance, Arsenjewicz, a Polish scientist, he is the flagship example of the survivors, professor of the Stefan Batory University in Vilnius. And that professor had scientific internships in the Third Reich, and he was the specialist in Nazi and Soviet economy. So the Soviets came to a conclusion that in the future, once there is a breakout of the war against Nazi Germany, and Stalin knew it would happen one day, then undoubtedly having a scientist like that would be helpful. Also, dozens of medical doctors survived, and those were Polish professors of medicine from the military medicine faculty. So if you look at the list of survivors, if you think of it, it turns out many of those who survived were medical doctors. And at the very last moment, it was decided that they would not perish. Also, among the survivors, those were the specialists in foreign languages. So they selected a number of Polish specialists in a number of foreign languages that were not very much in use. And there is this strange domain in linguistics, and in the two camps, there were some outstanding Polish inventors from the Faculty of Military Technology. So some of those inventors were killed, but some of those inventors survived. And then, just like Tadeusz Wolsza, some of them were later on carrying out their scientific activities in the British Isles with quite a big benefit to the Allies. So of the survivors, were any of them of any significance later on? If we look at the period of the war, then out of the survivors, if my memory serves me right, no one of those during the war, I emphasize, none of them took part in the operations of the Polish underground. But some of the survivors later on were very much important people in the Polish army, and the best career was done by Professor Wacław Komornicki, and he turned out to be Minister of Justice. In 1941, he returned. Well, after Majski-Sikorski agreement, he was sent to the UK, and he was a minister in the Polish government in the exile. Many Polish officers were promoted to higher ranks, and many of them became quite outstanding military inventors, and many of them served in the army, in the Polish army. And they were serving in the army at high ranks, General Wojciech, Colonel Kubicki, Colonel Felsztyn. Those were the people who served in the army as line officers. And I also would like to speak about another interesting person. It's an example of a soldier whose life was sent due to his military career. Narcyz Łupianowski, cavalry captain. He was a hero of the Godziowce battle. His soldiers, the cavalry soldiers, dismounted the cavalry horses, and they were fighting as the infantry. And during the skirmishes, some say it was a battle, they were capable of destroying 20 Soviet tanks. That was the greatest Soviet failure in the brief Polish-Soviet war in 1939. But Łupianowski was a prisoner of war in the Soviet hands. So one might think that he was doomed to die quickly. However, someone thought of his name and associated his name with that particular battle, and then the Red Army generals, or maybe higher than that, maybe somewhere in the Kremlin, someone said, okay, how about serving for the Red Army? And the Russians said, listen, Captain, well, of course, I've been coloring a little bit, but this is more or less how it could be. They said, Captain, you know, we're going to have a war with Germany, so we're going to fight against the Germans as well. So you have this experience. And at Koziotce, you showed what you were capable of as a commander. So how about serving for the Red Army? You choose your rank and position, and you choose where you want to fight. And Łupianowski disagreed, but he survived. And then later on, he could make his own depositions. So this is yet another example of an interesting case. And it's not the military career that saved him, because it is not to say that he was an outstanding officer, but still, he did make his huge contribution in demasking of all of that was happening in the Soviet Union, because he made his depositions to the Carstens Committee in the US. And Carstens Committee was unveiling the Stalin's crimes. And at that time, Łupianowski there, he made his depositions, and his facts, his story was very important. So there are people, there are stories, there are different biographies, but those who survived, most of them made their military career. They were serving in the Polish army in the West. And practically speaking, all of them stayed in emigration.
Later, they never returned to Poland. May I have the next question, please?
Next question, is there a direct relationship between the discovery of the Katyn graves and the murder of General Sikorski?
Często powtarzające się pytanie.
That's a question that pops up quite often. Indeed, there was this moment when historians interpreted this issue in this light, namely, General Sikorski was overly involved in the Katyn crime, and as a result, he died in the Gibraltar catastrophe. I saw films, videos on this very subject. Also, books were published, including books that were written in Germany by not so much historians, but amateur historians, and they claimed that these two events were interconnected. So the British archives are not open to the Polish historians, and that suggests that there is something there, namely, it is possible that General Sikorski paid the highest price for his attempts to solve the Soviet crimes. In the documents that I studied, I didn't find any confirmation to that effect, but it might have been the case, though. Professor Glinka, my close personal friend, studies the Polish-British relationship. And he is very knowledgeable about that. He actually studied documents at the Public Record Office, which stores all the publicly available documents. Not a single document that he finds there that would confirm the theory that Sikorski's death is anyway linked to the Katyn crime. However, there are still the documents that are not available to us, and there might be confirmation there. I believe that some documents will remain classified by the British for another 20 years. Some people claim that it is not due to the Katyn crime, that it's caused by something else. By the way, allegedly, let me stress that. It is not something that I'm coming up with. Allegedly, then, there are those documents that have not been made available to the Polish historians, and it covers or deals with the fact that Sikorski had some kind of a relationship with the Vichy government, which would be a stain on his character. Now, the Katyn crime. The suggestion that we have heard at this point is not justified. The situation might change once we have gotten access to all the British documents, including those that remain for the time being classified. May I have the next question, please?
Yes, Mrs. Piórkowska is asking several questions. One of them is why Institute of National Remembrance is failing to pressure the British government actually to release and reveal the documents that relate to Frank Stuband, Captain Gilder, and Colonel Stevenson testimonies.
Dobrze, to może po kolei będę na to
Let
pierwszy.
me just answer it one by one. Let me start with the first one. Krystyna, I know Krystyna very well. I've been to the US and I met her at the Józef Piłsudski Institute. Krystyna has written an important book on the Katyn witnesses. I have read it with great pleasure. I know that she is a great expert in the field. So, hello to you. Now, your question. So, the Institute of National Remembrance, they didn't do about this. They did nothing about this at this point. Maybe one could do something about that in the foreseeable future. I'm a member of the Institute of the National Remembrance College. In this term, I had the college's work. So I will actually make this appeal to President Nawrocki at the next meeting. And by the way, he is somewhere close to you. He is in the US. Now, I don't know where exactly. So I will ask him. We may suggest that we turn to various British institutions so that they make available a number of documents. So I understand that certain efforts have been made, but Krystyna got a file that was empty. So as you can see, you have good intentions and it gives you nothing. And I've just learned that Mr. Nawrocki is in Chicago right now. Anyway, back to the subject at hand. It's a very good idea. The Institute for National Remembrance is the most relevant body, and it should be the institute to actually tackle this issue. By the way, they are in touch with the foreign ministry, they have good rapport, so maybe jointly something could happen. I'm not sure whether it's going to work or not, but first we need to give it a try, right? We need to give it a try first. Without that, we don't know how successful it's going to be. However, this is the right way of thinking. I am the president of the College of the National Remembrance Institute, so in this capacity, I will put this matter to the college and to the institute.
There were two questions that related to elimination of Polish elites. This is a context of intelligence action. As we know, Katyn kind of dwarfs in comparison with what was happening in the western part of Poland after this Polish territory was occupied by Germany. Pomorze, Wielkopolska, all this intelligent action, Pommern, Posen, Schlesien, Litzmannstadt. This actually resulted in deaths of maybe up to 90,000 people within just several months of occupation of those territories. Could you shed some light on it? These are two questions that I combined into one, actually.
Dobrze, proszę Państwa, to jest
Sure.
rzeczywiście bardzo ważne pytanie.
Yes, this question is very important indeed, and a very dramatic question in that.
Wszystkich Polaków, bo
It's important for all Poles.
przed
Let's be honest about that.
wybuchem wojny polska inteligencja
Let's look at the Polish intelligentsia before World War II. There were few and far between.
to, że Polacy mogli studiować gdzieś tam daleko we Francji,
So
w Szwajcarii,
when
w Moskwie,
Poland had been partitioned,
w innych uczelniach.
Poles could study in various academic centers in Europe, in Vienna, France, in Paris. But then after the war,
Dopiero
it was rather difficult to build a strong Polish society and academic elites.
w 1939 roku
So what happened in 1939 and 1940 was absolutely terrible. And this is a crime that was committed both by the Soviets and by the Germans. The Polish elites were decimated. By the way, officers were also well educated, so they were also members of the intelligentsia. So you have Katyn, that's the first crime. Secondly, you had Western Ukraine, yes, Western Belarus, people imprisoned there. You've got Palmyry, you've got Wawer, Piaśnica,
niemieckie obozy koncentracyjne,
also the German concentration camps, because the Germans started to establish them as of 1940, and what we see are tens of thousands of victims.
Rady Narodowej Rzeczypospolitej Polskiej w Londynie.
So there was this council,
Nie pochodzący z wyborów, ale z nominacji.
the Polish Council in London.
Co dzieje się w Polsce.
So
Adam
a
Prager,
discussion on what is happening in Poland. Adam Bragier, one of the delegates representing the Polish Socialist Party, he is having a conversation with another member of this
w Polsce
parliament in exile, if you will.
są na masową skalę
So he says,
na ludności cywilnej, w tym
Poles are being executed en masse. Polish Jews are being executed en masse.
informację z kraju i podaje,
And he
że sprawa dotyczy
says another thing.
za ostatnie kilkanaście dni.
What's happened in the last dozens days or so? Tens of thousands of people were killed. 100,000, possibly 200,000 people killed in the last 2 weeks. And they are actually talking about thinking, what do we do now? What do we do about that? So one of the members of this council says the following words. Tomorrow we can write that Germans murdered in Poland in a matter of 2 weeks, 200,000 people. If we write that, nobody is going to believe that. Nobody.
że te zbrodnie są tak na masową skalę.
Nobody will believe that
Napiszmy
this is the scale.
w komunikacie,
So
że
we could
zamordowanych
write something else in our message. Let's write that tens or hundreds of people were killed, because this will be believable.
one były prawdziwe.
By the way, those numbers were real. 100, 200, 300,000 people. These were actual numbers, but people worldwide didn't believe that. Coming back to Katyn
Popełnioną przez
and
Niemców.
other
Lepszym przykładem,
crimes,
przepraszam za opowiem najlepszy przykład, bo mówimy o śmierci.
crimes committed in the Polish intelligentsia by the Germans. So what would be the best example?
Są to dwie siostry.
So there are those two sisters,
Dwie siostry, córki generała Dowbor-Muśnickiego.
Dobór Muśnicki's daughter, General Dobór Muśnicki's daughter, to be exact.
o nazwisku Lewandowska
Lewandowska
zostaje zamordowana w Katyniu.
is murdered in Katyn.
Jest więźniarką obozu w Kozielsku.
She is an inmate in Pozielsko.
I
She has been identified.
nie zostanie podane do wiadomości publicznej.
By the way, this name will never be made public because the Germans didn't know what to do with that,
Bo nie przypuszczali, że mogła w obozie być z mężczyznami kobieta.
because they never assumed that a woman could be there with men. Then the situation was actually explained.
Sowiet.
She is a
W tym samym
Soviet victim.
w Poznaniu
Roughly at the same time, in Poznań, her sister is murdered by the Germans.
zaangażowana w działalność konspiracyjną wymierzoną.
She is
Mamy dwie
a
siostry,
member
z rąk
of
Sowietów.
the Polish resistance fighting the Germans. Two sisters, one killed by the Soviets, the other by the Germans.
Były losy
So it all shows how dramatic was the fate of the Poles. There's just one family. He had two daughters. General had two daughters, and both died
w latach II wojny światowej.
during World War II.
Śmierć
Both
w walce.
died
Zginęła jako
on the battlefield. One of the women was a pilot, and she fight in fight, and the other daughter
antyniemiecka.
was involved in
Był to dramat,
anti-German activities in the underground. So yes, there were so many stories like that, so many more stories like that, but that was not a coincidence.
czyli i Niemcy, i Sowieci,
Both sides, that is the Soviets and the Germans,
inteligencji polskiej.
wanted to eliminate Polish intelligentsia. The Polish state was supposed to no longer exist. The Poles were not meant to have their own statehood. The Poles were there to stay as slaves for some time,
Osób do egzekucji była taka.
because the gradation for execution was the following, as far as the Germans are concerned: first the Jews, then the Roma, then
Słowianie, w tym Polacy.
the Slavs,
Rosjanie,
the Polish included, and the Russians
może troszeczkę innym tropem poszli.
had somewhat different
Eliminacja
logic. So first and foremost, to eliminate the Polish intelligentsia, hence the four deportations in 1940 and 41.
mówią, że te
And some were saying that as many as 1,500,000 people were deported. Maybe this is too much, too many, but there is this dispute among the historians how many people were actually deported. But in any case, I think,
czy wydaje mi się, jestem pewny,
well, I don't think I know, I'm sure
element
that was an element of that activity, that the objective of which was to eliminate Polish intelligentsia. And the Katyn operation, had its reverberations, because fathers, grandfathers, and sons and brothers were killed in Katyn, and their families were taken in to the forest. So the Russians were trying to conceal the traces, to cover up, and to take away all of the witness, because if people are in Kazakhstan or somewhere in the steppe far away, they would not be looking for their husbands, brothers, cousins, and grandfathers. So that was a crime that was meant to be well hidden. And that crime was committed in order to get rid of the Polish intelligentsia to begin with, and then of the Poles. So the war then was going on, and Germany started the war against the Soviet Union, but who knows how it could have been had it been a different course of events. Any more questions, please?
A short comment on my part. My family comes from an area around Bobruisk, historically speaking, and a good portion of my family actually, after 1920, after the Riga Treaty, was left outside of the Polish borders. And so we have within the family actually lots of additional history that is not covered here by the topics that we started. Polish operation of 1937-38. There is 17 Jeśmans on the list of Russian memorial as victims of just Polish operation in 1937-38. So there is a broader context. It's not that killing started in 1939. It is basically much longer period from 1917. Lots of Poles were murdered in the territories that were left after the Riga Treaty. So this was a general comment. Also, going to the West, my grandfather was a mayor of Śrem, that's Wielkopolska, and he was on the prescription list. He survived the war, but was murdered in 1946 after the war. So he was in hiding for over 6 years. So all these things are very much connected here, both the elimination of elites on the eastern side of Poland as well as on the western part. Next question is about a contemporary issue. This is lawsuits that were originated in Strasbourg International Tribunal against Russia. Nothing came out of it as far as I know. Do you have any comments? What was actually the official stated reason why the International Tribunal did not proceed with this case?
Jeśli chodzi o tę sprawę,
As far as this case is concerned,
przede wszystkim to jest rzecz, którą trudno przeprowadzić.
well, to begin with, it's a difficult case to proceed with. That is due to the fact that Russia is the country that is not particularly interested in having that case, because that may lead to some compensations, big compensations to be paid, because any crime means victims and members of families of those who are murdered at a later stage may press their claims before the court. Therefore, I don't know which Russian institutions were active in that, because I was not following that particular case. It's more for the lawyers. But from what I know, the general tune is not to proceed with the case, because that may, in the future, lead to attempts of claiming compensation, and the Polish lawyers who were representing the Polish interests in that case and who were operating in this EU legal environment, they were openly saying that it was not about compensation. They were saying that the point was to close the case, to have it settled, to have decisions taken, so as not to return to it. So what actually happened, I do not know, but I know that this case was being initiated a number of times, but the Polish lawyers were not working in the environment conducive to investigating that problem, clarifying that problem. So the first court decisions were not favorable. So what's going to happen next, I do not know. I have not been dealing with that particular case. I'm just consuming that knowledge. I have been reading about that court case in the Polish press, and in the Polish press they were saying that it was yet another failed attempt to run a court case. But after that, the case was no longer on the table. So perhaps this question should rather be addressed to the Polish lawyers who were involved in that particular case. But actually, it's not my cup of tea, and I do not have knowledge, detailed knowledge on that particular case. So I'm not in the position to give you any specific information. All I know that it was a failed attempt. And there was that potential possibility that it was all about a possibility of pressing for claims. But was it the main reason? Perhaps it was not the main reason in the case. I just do not know. But all I know that at some point there was a lot of talk about possible compensation. So next question, please.
Again, Krystyna Piórkowski is asking for more information about different reports. I am not really familiar with absolute majority of them, so it's difficult for me to even convey it here logically. But most probably, I would suggest that you two have some contact after this meeting here, and most probably some form of cooperation as far as creation of additional pressure on British government would be something sensible here. Most probably our IPN should be a part of it also.
Ja może tylko trzy
Just
zdania.
2 or 3 comments on that, because I think that Mrs. Piórkowska means that those who are investigating the Katyn massacre and those people who visited the Katyn site in 1943, they drafted some documentation upon their visit, and those documents were written as reports, and there is more than a dozen of such reports of different value, of different volume. There were also reports made by the British. There were also reports made by the Americans, and there are also reports of medical doctors of the International Medical Committee, Valtieri Hergetrans, and François Neville, and others also wrote the report. So I think that Krystyna is probably interested in, most probably interested in trying to use those reports. Luckily, those reports have survived until today. They have not been damaged and they are available. So how about printing, publishing those reports? That is a very good idea, because Malay's expert opinion will be there. Van Vleet's opinion will be there. We will have many other documents that were written by Wojciech, by Skarżyński. So we'll have reports made by medical doctors, by Katyn, and by Seyfried, and by many more people who either were in Katyn, but for some reason or the other were dealing with that. So there are reports drafted by the Americans, by Poles, Americans, British, Italians, Swiss, and representatives of other countries. And maybe such a publication, published in the Polish language and published in the English language, would be a very important item, position of great substantive value, and also would give a rank and file reader better understanding of the situation. All I can say that most probably in spring next year, we will finally publish, after many endeavors, all of the Katyn memoirs. So all those notes that have survived the Katyn massacre, all the documents that were collected from the pockets of victims, and currently they're being archived in the Institute of National Remembrance. So those notes shall be published finally, and that publication will bear the resemblance of the documents. Those will be the scans of the documents. It would be as if reading the originals, accompanied by commentary of historians and linguists. And also there may be the commentaries of some other specialists, because the word gives a possibility to have an insight into emotions. And emotions are within the remit of linguists, sociologists, and psychologists. And so I have asked the Institute of National Remembrance to address scientists and other fields of knowledge to create not just a volume containing the memoirs, but perhaps we should do more. How about analyzing those memoirs? And how about describing or annotating them with the specialists from many different fields of science? And I'm looking forward to this book being published, because first and foremost, there's going to be the first ever full publication of the so-called memoir. Sometimes it's just a brief note, because we think that memoir means a voluminous book and so on and so forth. No, not necessarily. Sometimes it's a note. It's just a sheet of paper, 1 page, 2 pages, 3 pages of text. It's not Wysocki's memoir, that was found at Major Solsky and then collected in Katyn, and then it was published. Yes, indeed, that is quite a big set of memoirs with many pages, but sometimes it's just a few sentences. But yes, we're talking about those Katyn memoirs, and if that is published together with the reports, then undoubtedly we're going to have 2 best-selling publishing items. So indeed, I would love to talk to Christina about that, and perhaps we might think how to cooperate on that matter.
If I could have the next question, please.
Okay, maybe this will be the last question. The question is about the cinematic portrayal of Katyn by Wajda. How true and how much of a fiction it was, as far as specific aspect of reaction of the Polish society after the release of this information.
Tak, to jest... O, pani Krystyna mi napisała w tej chwili, że...
Krystyna has just written, she will be in Warsaw in January, so we will meet and we will discuss just that. Basically, a fresh bit of information. So when it comes to report, that makes sense. Let me return to your question, Mr. Moderator. Andrzej Wajda's film. Let me address it the following way. There have been 4 documentaries on Katyn. The first made in 1943, and then the last one 1952. The first one, a German documentary, in German and in Polish. It's 20-odd minute long. Then there was another shorter documentary made by the French, because Brasilat, a French writer, visited Katyn in 1943, and this documentary was made for the French soldiers that fought in the East. The French army fought the Soviet army. Just like the Spanish, there was this Blue Division. The French collaborated with the Third Reich. They fought against the French. And then there was the Soviet film made by the Soviets that covered Bubenka's committee's works. And the fourth one was made by the Polish emigres in London. Not so well known. I presented it at 2 academic conferences because I brought it here to Poland. I also showed it in New York at the Józef Piłsudski Institute. A few dozen people were present. Coming back to Wajda's film, his motion picture, I like it a lot. There is some fiction there, but there is also a lot of truth in it. What do I mean by true? Because the author actually looked into the heart of the matter. So the question pertained to how the Poles reacted to it. You see 1943 there. General Smorawiński's family is in Kraków, and they learn that the victims are being identified. There is a list, and we see General Smorawiński's name there, and it's actually the case. The first message published in 2 local papers, you can find General Smorawiński's name. It's not fiction. And I mean here the papers published in Polish by Germans. And there are people queuing up to buy these issues because those poor quality papers are the only source on the Soviets' crime. And this was basically the only subject that was covered well by the Germans in the Polish language press. It was the only subject they didn't lie about. Furthermore, Polish readers could voice their own opinions. And it was actually very much publicized an issue by the Germans. The Germans wanted this information to reach the loved ones of the victims murdered in Katyn. So basically it was a part of their propaganda efforts. Notice, what do we see in Wajda's film? You can see an excerpt from a German documentary made in 1943. There's more to it. Dr. Tadeusz Pawrowski is mentioned. There is a short commentary too. We learn that Dr. Pawrowski studies a victim that has been exhumed. Tadeusz Pragnowski was a member of the Polish Red Cross Committee that actually studied the crime. Dotyk Katynia is a book that I wrote. It was translated into English in the US. Ms. Pawrowski's daughter, actually approached me, and she sent all the papers she had on the subject. And by the way, I told her that you can see your father in this German propaganda video from 1943. She didn't know it at the time. So, what about 1945? The victims' families were trying to commemorate their loved ones. They put up plaques in cemeteries. And actually, this is what we find in the film, and it was the case. Such things did happen. Families would try to establish the whereabouts of their father, of their grandfather, of their loved ones. People would write letters to the highest authorities of the communist Poland. Fala 49, Wave 49. It was a show. People would write letters to Fala 49, way 49, and they would inquire about Katyn. Thousands of letters were sent, signed by a desperate wife waiting for her husband and crying children waiting to see their dad. And those letters asked for an explanation. What is happening? Years have been passing and we still don't know the whereabouts of our loved ones. So what Andrzej Wajda did in his film was he used information that he learned from historical books. And on top of that, he added certain layer of fiction, which is what directors do, because they need to build this tension, right? Because they add elements to the story so that their picture becomes even more dramatic, so that there is an angle in it. Yes, you might find events there that never happened, but this is what happens in films. You mix facts and fiction. This is the prerogative of an artist, I believe. This is what film is about. It was not a documentary, after all. In a documentary, you need to be very close to the truth, and we do that. In a motion picture, in a film, you rely on facts, you do. But there are things that have been added. Facts are mixed with fiction, but I don't mind. This is just how I see it. This is just my take on that. And by the way, the film was really good. By the way, for him, it was a personal film because his father died in Katyn, Captain Wajda. So basically, the director was duty-bound to make this film. If there are any other questions, I'm happy to answer.
Professor Wolsza, thank you very much for your great presentation. We hope that this is just the beginning of our more planned and more strategic contacts, both with you and the Kortyka Foundation. There is a definite need for conferences and lectures here, and we hope that this will be just the first step in a long cooperation. So, Jean, I wonder if you have any additional comments.
Well, I would simply just say that
Ja
I would
serdecznie
repeat.
dziękuję tylko. Aha, przepraszam.
Apologies, sorry.
My apologies to you, sir. No, I certainly agree with what Wojciech said, and we certainly do, I think, very much appreciate this extensive scholarly work that you provided to us and expanded our knowledge of this area. This is really, truly something that goes to the heart of Poles and Polish diaspora. So we do thank you, and we look forward to continuing our relationship with the Janusz Kortyka Foundation. Thank you very much.
Ja serdecznie dziękuję Państwu za uwagę i przepraszam, że tak długo.
Let me thank you for your attention. Thank you for bearing with me. I apologize, I took a lot of your time, but this is what happens sometimes. You see that your audience is interested, and then time disappears. And by the way, Katyn is so important that time should be irrelevant. We should simply keep talking about it, no matter what time it is, whether it is 5, 6, or 7 p.m. Katyn is timeless. This is a thing that needs to be discussed, and we need to do it well. Thank you for this meeting, and thank you for giving me this opportunity to present my work, and thank you for the questions that you have put to me. Some of them have been helpful in making things clearer. Thank you very much to all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Ladies and gentlemen, let me just say a few words. I would like to follow up on Professor Wolsza's work. One of his books has been given an award back in 2017 in the first edition of our competition. Our foundation has been working towards making this issue better known. We have been doing that because of how important this issue is for our identity. Furthermore, Katyn is very important for the Polish historical efforts. In 2017, our foundation organized an academic session involving the professor as well as other eminent experts in this field, both from Poland and from Russia, including representatives of the Memorial Organization. Your book has been promoted in the US in cooperation with the Polish Institute for National Remembrance. Our foundation has prepared the Katyn Massacre, the Country's Search, a book reviewed, among others, by Professor Berton Martin, a professor from the University in Freiburg. In this volume, you see a summary and comments on the research on Katyn. Basically, it is a summary of the state of research as of 2017. Professor Wolsza and other experts have included the works there, and we see different aspects of this crime. And we also see how different experts differently approach that matter. Why am I saying that? Because I'm trying to show that our foundation has been trying to make excellent works better known, such as professors' work, but also we'd like to take this opportunity to present the Polish academic efforts.
And also we wish to support those instruments that help us to tell Polish, to talk about Polish history, to tell about this history to the world. I would like to thank our staff. I'd like to thank also to thank Jean Sokolowski, to thank Wojciech Jeśmin. I would also like to thank for your kind agreement and your interest in co-organizing this event. I also would like to thank Professor Wolsza for sharing with us a very interesting lecture and for giving extensive answers to the questions. And judging by the messages on the chat, that has been quite an intellectual feast for all of us. So, dear Professor, thank you ever so much. And now it is over to my colleague, to Weronika, who is the coordinator of this project, The Seeds of History. Over to you. Yes, thank you very much for your kind participation in today's meeting. Already today, I'm inviting you to take part in the next meeting that will be organized within the framework of this project. This will be a conference entitled Seeds of History. The Polish Diaspora and the Poles abroad as the ambassadors of the good name of Poland abroad. That is going to be on the 18th of December 2021 at 5 p.m. Polish time. And as far as the details are concerned, please follow our social media, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. So thank you very much for your participation in today's meeting. Thank you very much for all your questions. All the best and bye-bye. Goodbye.
Do widzenia.